That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but I'm just kind of big for it. Hi folks, Fruit and Doggy here to do another book discussion, and today the book I'm discussing is The Duke of Sumava by Sarah Wrench. This book was published in 1997 and is just over 300 pages, not quite 310. Excuse me. And as always, I'm going to start off the book discussion by reading the summary. Such a choice. Once upon a time, long ago, excuse me. Once upon a time, long ago and far away, there was a land called Sumava. Healthy, prosperous, and free, its duke was beloved with the people for his wisdom and compassion. For an aristocrat, he wasn't bad at all. Of course, it couldn't last. Other rulers, more adept and ruthless at squeezing the last penny from their people, saw the wealth of Sumava and saw that it could be theirs. Now his army's on the verge of surrender and his land's in ruin. The Duke is faced with an awful choice. The door has suddenly opened, and those on the other side have offered him their aid. But woe to the mortal who accepts such an offer. And I actually have to admit that it's a little misleading there, but the sort of a teaser is very relevant actually to this summary. It's a little surprising how relevant it is. I've read so many teasers that seem to be just a random page grab, but this ties in so closely, it'd be a shame not to read it. Sole option. Duke Ottokar heard cackles and titters and guffaws all around him. However quickly he turned, he saw nothing but forest. "Please show yourselves," he called. "Perhaps," replied a treacly male voice that made chills grab his spine. "First, what will you give for a horse? Would you give your soul or your country?" "Hell no!" Ottokar was furious and scared and outraged. "I don't need a horse that much. I'll walk." "But you owe your country to me," said the voice, and his owner stepped out from behind a tree. Ottokar stumbled back a pace as he beheld a legend in the flesh. If a devil had flesh. Black cloak, shiny black boots with spurs, a wide-brimmed black hat pulled down over the ghostly white face, so that only a mocking smile and straggling beard were visible. "The Black Huntsman!" choked Ottokar. "The same. You invoked me." "Not so fast, Samuel!" A female voice broke in. An ethereal woman was standing where no one had been a moment before. She tilted her pointed chin at Samuel and said, "He invoked us as well." "He is still in my debt," snarled Samuel. He glared at the woman, then fixed his burning gaze on Ottokar. "Until later, Duke Ottokar. Remember, you owe me for a life." There was a burst of yellow smoke, and he was gone, leaving an awful stench. Ottokar shivered. How could he have been mad enough to invoke the evil huntsman? And who on earth was this enchanting creature? He turned to her, trying to dredge up some courtly manners from his war-torn memory. "Madam," he said, "I hope you are a better creditor than the Black Huntsman." Excuse me. And where I disagreed about the general summary is that, one, Sumava isn't really a rich, plentiful land. It's described as a land that's has heavy, long winters. About 8 months out of the year, it's kind of a cold climate, and so they have enough supplies to make it through. They're able to produce enough goods that they can trade for food items, and other goods. So I suppose in that sense, they have plenty, and they have a bit of an aristocratic class because they're able to develop refined goods. So I guess that's not entirely wrong, but it seemed just a little bit skewed to say that it was rich. I just didn't. It wasn't, drowning in gold or silver and those sorts of precious metals or a diamond mine or anything of that nature. And then it suggests a little too strongly that his lands are already in ruin. And yes, he's definitely on the ropes. He's definitely feeling cornered. Uh, and in all likelihood, if it weren't for what happens throughout the story, the various events and aid that he receives, that he would have lost his country. But I think it overhyped it, or it overstated the conditions a little bit. However, I will admit that I do enjoy this book. The main character is Duke Ottokar. He is, it seems that he's actually the entire ruler of his country, but he goes by the term of Duke. I would confess that I am more ignorant of medieval era than my reading of all these fantasy books would somewhat imply. And with some of the different references it made to Emperor Ferdinand, it named two popes specifically. It talked about Spain and France. It seems pretty clear to me that this is our world, and it's probably a specific time period. I know that it's past the point of Lutherans, so I wish I could give a better time period in the book, because it seems pretty clear that it's referencing a certain point in our history, but I just don't know that time period and these specific facets well enough to actually point my finger and it's like, oh, that's clearly in the 1200s or the 11th century, so on and so forth. And I'm surprised that it didn't really just specifically state years with it making all those references. But anyways, the main character, Ottokar, I found him realistic to an extent. I think he did suffer from sort of being a little too perfect in some ways. He was a little too charismatic, too personable. It's not even necessarily that. It's not that he was just exuberant and charming, but just that so noble, I suppose, was the issue, is that he seemed always so selfless. And it just didn't strike me as 100% realistic. For instance, he finds some precious rubies, but he has no interest in them for their wealth. And then almost to some extent, it seems like he doesn't even fully appreciate their value as far as just their sheer value in gold and what he could do with them. I mean, he does utilize them to a good extent. He does utilize those rubies to purchase things for his people, but I don't know. He always put everybody else first. And yes, I understand that's an ideal characteristic for a leader to take, but he had so little ambition for himself. He was so willing to sacrifice everything, and he didn't hesitate in considering the different pressures on him, the different possibilities and different choices he had to make. I can understand why he would hesitate. That's why, on the one hand, I think I really appreciated this character, but somehow it just didn't strike a perfect chord. There was just a little bit of a false twang, I guess, is the best way I can describe it. That's the best I can do to put my finger on it. Because again, he did also have some other characteristic flaws. He was a little too proud. He could unintentionally undervalue or see others as being incompetent. And that was kind of funny too, because with his interactions with mystical beings in this book, he was, introduced to new elements, and he was early on quite powerless. and going into spoiler territory, he ends up developing powers himself, and it's sort of a that I view that as a negative in this book, but it's more because of that fitting such a trope and such a pattern that I'm just tired of seeing that everywhere I go in every book I read, where a character has no powers, has no awareness of any special abilities. They're introduced into a new world by characters who have those abilities, and then as they slowly dig through the layers, it's like, oh wait, you actually have magical powers too. And it turns out that he is reasonably pretty powerful. He has quite a bit of magic at his disposal, it turns out, and I think it would have been a little bit better if he himself had more limitations. But again, that's more about the trope, and I'm just annoyed seeing characters with no power ascend to such high levels so suddenly. The other thing I guess I'll mention as a negative is that the pacing of the book, I thought it was pretty good through at the first 2/3 or so, but then in the last few dozen pages, it seemed to really skip through large portions of time. And I understand why they did this. I think they were trying to get through different events, different milestones, and set up a situation where it's not a super cheesy and they lived happily ever after, but still was mostly positive. And again, this ties into how he was so self-sacrificing. By the end, he makes a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself, not technically his life, but excuse me, he does make a significant sacrifice, but it's left on a bit of a cliffhanger that he might be able to regain what he sacrificed. He might be able to, and I don't want to spell it out exactly. I want to leave a little bit of, leave it a little unclear in case anybody is watching through and would still want to read this. So it kind of leaves that door open, but unless I'm mistaken, I don't believe there's a sequel. I'll have to look online and see if there is or isn't, but I think what the author was doing was trying to go through different events, go into his future, and I guess I already said that. Basically, set up a situation where he's able to make that sacrifice, do the noble thing, protect his country, yet not just be, well, everything turned out 100% hokey dokey, happily ever after, fairy tale. I think he's just trying to avoid being overly cheesy. I think that's what I should say she was going for. What I did like about the book, aside from the character who could be a little overly emotional, was that I just enjoyed the characters overall. I thought there was a good supporting cast, just supporting characters who could sort of make up for his flaws, and I thought the book did a decent job exploring magical abilities, and I should say sort of a parallel dimension as well. I found the setting to be quite interesting, as it dealt with that parallel dimension that basically, I mean, when I say parallel, it's quite almost literal, because the second dimension is shares geographical similarities. They are, if there's a mountain here, there's a mountain there. If there's a river here, there's a river there. They're basically a replication of each other, but as the human in the human world where they are more building cities and are a little bit more technologically driven. Again, medieval times, but you know what I'm comparing or getting at. In the other world, the world of fairies and elves and so on and so forth, it was more magically driven, and so they were allowing nature to be to flourish, to be at the forefront. And they did have buildings, but they weren't tamping down nature as much because they were more in harmony with nature. But I would definitely say that I would actually recommend buying this book, at the very least borrowing it, because again, I thought it covered magic in a very interesting way. I liked the parallel worlds. I can't say that that was original. Again, I mean, I can't really say in any fantasy book I'm likely to read that what I'm going to encounter will be entirely unique or something I haven't seen elsewhere, but I like them. I still enjoyed the magic. I enjoyed the characters and the situations they wound up in and how matters were resolved. And I did have a few issues that I took umbrage with, some things that sort of annoyed me or I saw as a little trite, but overall I enjoyed it, and I'll have to keep this author in mind. I will have to see if there was a sequel or if she's written any continuing series, because I wouldn't mind seeing what else she's capable of. But, anyways, that's my recommendation, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you later, folks, and as always, fruit and doggy.